Let's start with this first of the three factors that I'm going to focus on as we talk about how the news comes to look the way it does, what shapes the news. The first is the institutional structure. This should be fairly obvious. Right? People do things, but people do things within institutions, yes? If you want to understand this class, do you look solely at me as an individual, or do you look at the institutional structure of the University of Texas to understand this class as well? Well, certainly we want to look at institutions. So let's take a minute and think about the institutional structure of the U.S. mainstream news media, the corporate commercial news media. Okay? Let's think about it. There's a clear hint in where I'm going with this because I keep calling the mainstream news media corporate commercial, yes? What do I mean by corporate commercial? One, corporate. It's organized in a corporate form, the corporation. Most of the mainstream news comes to us through corporations. Second, it's commercial. It's for-profit. There are both for-profit and non-profit corporations. The vast majority of journalism goes forward through for-profit corporations. Corporate and commercial, the way it's organized and the goal of that organization. It's organized in the corporate form, and it's organized to produce a profit. So let's think about it for a second. Right? You've got a corporation. How are corporations organized? It's very simple. They're organized hierarchically. Has anyone ever worked in a corporation? Yeah? Were you the CEO? No, you were somewhere below the CEO. And what was your relationship to the CEO? Friendly, cordial, and a peer relationship where you were on an equal level? And your opinions mattered exactly the same as the CEO? No?
I bought her Sonic every day.
You what?
I bought her Sonic every day.
You bought her Sonic. Okay, I'm not sure I want to... The details of your job we'll leave for now. Involve picking up lunch, apparently. But, okay. So we know that corporations are organized hierarchically, yes? That's not, idiosyncratic. That's by law. That's the nature of a corporation. You have a board of directors, which represents the owners. They hire managers. The managers hire subordinates. Power in a corporation flows from the top down. If you've ever worked near the bottom of a corporation, that's where I spent most of my life, near the bottom of almost every organization. It's very clear how power flows. It flows from up there, and it flows down. Now, as a worker in a corporation, you may have input, yes? The CEO might seek your input, but input is not decision-making power. You all have input into this class. I'm happy to take your input into this class. I'd love your feedback. Let's chat later about it. Does that give you power? Do you have power by virtue of having input? No. Right? So most of the mainstream news outlets we're going to talk about are organized in a corporate form, which means they're hierarchical. Power concentrated at the top, power flows down. They're commercial. They exist to turn a profit. That's not just me offering an opinion. That's, by law and tradition, the nature of a corporation, yes? By law and tradition, corporations have one and only one function in the world, which is to produce profit, to maximize return to shareholders. That's, in fact, its legal duty, what in the law they call the fiduciary duty. In a corporation, by law, you have to make money for your shareholders. Right? So you have an institution that is organized hierarchically, all power concentrated at the top, and it has one and only one role in the world, which is to generate profit. Right? That's the institutional structure. Now, let's ask a simple question. What do these corporations that we're talking about, what do they sell? The media corporations, what do they sell? Any thoughts? CBS News, the New York Times, what do they sell? They sell ad space. That's another way of saying they sell your attention. Newspapers and broadcast outlets, they don't sell the news, and they don't sell TV programs. They sell you. They sell your attention. They produce news and programming so that you will watch or listen or read. But what media corporations are actually selling is your attention. Okay? They sell that to advertisers. Now, they also might charge you a little bit for the newspaper, but the vast majority of the revenues in American publishing come from advertising. In broadcast television, 100% of the revenue comes from advertising, since over-the-air broadcast television and radio doesn't cost anything. In cable TV, the majority of the revenue is from advertising. So in the contemporary news media, corporate and commercial with an advertising revenue stream, what the media corporations are selling is your attention. And who are they selling that to? For the most part, other corporations. The people purchasing that advertising are almost always other corporations, sometimes small businesses, but for the most part, corporations. So let's think about the institutional structure of American mainstream news. You have one set of corporations which tend to be rather large. Okay? American news media corporations have been increasingly conglomerating, coming together, forming large corporations. Where there once used to be lots of little news media outlets, they're increasingly concentrated in ownership. They are selling, so you have large corporations selling your attention to other corporations, most of which are also very large. You know, consumer products corporations like Procter & Gamble, for instance, or the auto companies, right? The major purchases of advertising in the United States are huge corporations. Right? So on either end of this equation, you have large corporations selling the attention of people to other large corporations. Now let's talk a little bit about the people in the middle, you. Are advertisers equally interested in all people? Do advertisers want to reach all people equally? Why not? Who do they want to reach? Target audiences, which tend to be people with disposable income, yes? So advertisers are interested in reaching those people with resources. Right? And it will depend. The demographics that advertisers are trying to reach will depend on their product or service. Okay. So let's step back. The institutional structure that we're talking about for the vast majority of American news involves one set of corporations, typically large corporations, selling the attention of people, preferably the most demographically desirable people, which almost always translates into the most affluent people, to other large corporations. See what I'm saying here? One set of large corporations selling the attention of the most affluent people to other large corporations. That's the institutional structure of American news. Now, let's say you knew nothing else about news media except what we just talked about. Step back. What picture of the world, what general outlook do you think would emerge from a system in which one set of corporations sells the attention of the most affluent people in the culture to other large corporations? What general picture of the world is likely to emerge from that system? Is it a picture of the world that is relentlessly hostile to the interests of wealthy people? No, it doesn't seem that that's what would happen. Would a system like that produce a news media that is relentlessly hostile to the interests of the people who run the system? No, that's not the way systems do not produce things that undermine the system, for the most part. All right? The reason we go through this is because in the United States today, there's a common assumption about news media. What is it? That news media are too liberal, that they're too radical, that news media are anti-American, that news media somehow are hostile to the interests of all that is good and true in America. You hear this over and over again. The news media are too liberal. Well, we'll talk more about what liberal and conservative mean, but just think for a minute about the institutional structure of news. Does it make sense that a system in which large corporations sell the attention of affluent people to other large corporations would produce a journalism that is hostile to the interests of wealthy people, elite. Do you imagine that that's what would happen? I don't imagine that. So the first thing to understand about news content, it is shaped by an institutional structure, and you have to understand what that institutional structure is. After class, I'll send you some links to websites where you can see how this media concentration works out. You can see what are the nature of those media corporations. But for now, I'll direct you to the material about this in the Lance Bennett book. The material about political economy. Political economy being that term we use to study the politics of a structure of an institution like this. Okay? So the institutional structure of news media is the first thing to consider when we're asking how is news shaped. Our goal is to understand how the news that we pick up every day, that we read and listen to every day, how it comes to be the way it is. And one of the factors that we're going to think about is the institutional structure. Questions about that before we move on? As I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that in class. You can read about that in the book. All right, what I want to talk now and spend the rest of today and the next several class periods on is this question of an ideological framework. News is produced within an institutional structure. It's also produced within an ideological framework. This is not, again, I don't think it's a contentious claim. It's kind of self-evident. Everything human beings do is produced within some ideological framework, and we're going to spend the next few days talking about that. In class on Tuesday, I'll specifically take up the question of ideology and what we mean by it. But before we get into that, I want to talk about a kind of background question. Before we start talking about ideology, I want to talk about the question of neutrality. Because when we start analyzing news media, what we're going to find is that the critique that we're going to engage in will produce a response from journalists. So we're going to offer this critique of news media. We're going to look at factors that shape news content. And journalists are not always going to agree with this analysis, and they're going to have a response. And their response is going to be to the institutional question that, sure, news is predominantly produced within these corporate commercial, hierarchically organized for-profit corporations. But journalists retain a certain sense of independence from that. Right? The first response that journalists will make is, no, we're independent. Right? Let me give you an example of this from a panel discussion of journalists discussing, in this case, the topic was coverage of the war in Iraq, but it's not the war in Iraq I want to highlight. What I'm going to do is just play a minute of a comment from a man named Leroy Sievers, who is, or was, I'm not sure if he still is, a producer with ABC News Nightline, one of the premier broadcast television news programs in the United States. And I'll explain the importance of this. Very short little clip, but very important. Leroy starts out by acknowledging that he has a politics, everybody in journalism has a politics, that there are questions about how news is shaped. But he's responding to the critique that the institutional structure is important. And how does he respond? He says, no one from the network has ever called us at Nightline to tell us what to run. He's suggesting that while there is that structure, Leroy isn't stupid. He realizes ABC News is a corporation. It's hierarchical. He realizes that he serves at the pleasure of the boss. He can be fired at any time. And he realizes it's a for-profit corporation that exists to generate profit for shareholders. But he says, listen, the way it works out is that we have what's sometimes called a firewall. The journalism side, the business advertising side, they stay separate. The people over in the corporate offices don't call and tell us what to run. Now, That claim is generally true, I believe, based on my own experience and my own discussions with lots of journalists and my own reading of the research. It is relatively rare that people from the corporate side dictate content to people on the journalistic side. Okay? It does happen occasionally, and when it happens, it's usually big news. There have been some examples where the business side, the advertising side, said to the journalists, thou shalt run or not run a story, and it usually causes controversy. And the fact that it causes controversy tells you that that firewall, in fact, to some degree, does exist on a regular basis. Now, what Leroy Sievers is not understanding is when he says, they never call me to tell me what to run, you can hear that somebody shouted it out from the audience. And what they shouted was, they don't have to call you. The point being made by the audience is, the reason the network doesn't call you to tell you to not run or to run stories is because you've already been socialized to do what the network wants you to do. So the argument that the institutional structure isn't a primary factor because the people in the business and advertising side do not routinely impose their vision of journalism on the journalists ignores a deeper question, which is there a process of socialization by which journalists do not need to be controlled directly, especially by the time they get up to the level of something like ABC News Nightline? They have been socialized to understand what the corporation wants and doesn't want. And that's going to lead us to this second question about ideological framework, and then into the third question about professional practices. So if the reaction to the discussion of institutional structures is they really don't matter because we have a system that protects journalists, okay, sometimes that system in fact works. But what about the deeper questions about socialization? And that's where we're going to start today.